Right now, a single microscopic layer, just 50 micrometers thick, is the only thing separating your bloodstream from 4 pounds of toxic intestinal bacteria. Yet wellness influencers claim that tiny barrier is tearing apart, blaming this leaky gut for everything from brain fog to stubborn weight gain. Here is the shocking medical paradox. Intestinal permeability is 100% real, but the billion-dollar supplement industry is lying about how to fix it. By the end of this deep dive, you will discover the exact biological trigger that forces your cellular gates open, plus 2 science-backed repair protocols. If you want the real science behind metabolism and longevity without the expensive marketing hype, subscribe right now. Now let's get into the biological truth. To understand why your intestinal lining fails, picture a 40,000 square foot tennis court folded tightly inside your abdomen, guarded by just one layer of epithelial cells. These delicate epithelial cells are stitched together by complex protein structures called tight junctions, which act exactly like microscopic Velcro strips sealing a high-pressure pipe. Unlike a brick wall, these tight junctions are highly dynamic gates that must constantly open to absorb vital water and nutrients, then instantly snap shut. The medical crisis happens when specific molecular triggers jam those Velcro strips open long-term, allowing microscopic bacterial fragments directly into your sterile bloodstream. The most dangerous invader sneaking across is lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, a toxic cell wall fragment detached from dying gram-negative bacteria living inside your colon. Once LPS breaches the barrier, your immune system treats it like a full-blown bacterial invasion, instantly launching systemic low-grade inflammation throughout your entire circulatory system. This chronic endotoxemia directly interferes with insulin receptors on your muscle cells, explaining why a damaged gut barrier drives unexplained weight gain and severe fatigue. Gastroenterologists hate the term leaky gut because wellness marketers weaponized it. But in clinical research, we call this documented phenomenon increased intestinal permeability. In 2000, Harvard researcher Dr. Alessio Fasano made a groundbreaking discovery when he identified zonulin, the human protein that commands tight junctions to unlock. Zonulin acts like a molecular master key that docks onto specific intestinal receptors, triggering an internal pulley system that physically pulls your epithelial cells apart. Fasano proved that exactly 2 primary triggers force your body to flood your digestive tract with zonulin, harmful intestinal bacteria, and a protein called gliadin. Gliadin is the tough, alcohol-soluble protein fragment found inside wheat gluten that your human digestive enzymes cannot completely break down into individual amino acids. Shockingly, clinical trials confirm that undigested gliadin triggers zonulin release and temporary intestinal openings in every single human, even if you do not have celiac disease. In a healthy gut, these gates reseal within 20 minutes, but if you have underlying inflammation or dysbiosis, the gates stay jammed wide open indefinitely. Beyond wheat proteins, modern American grocery shelves are packed with synthetic dietary emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 that act like dish soap against your gut lining. Just as dish soap dissolves grease on plates, synthetic emulsifiers chemically strip away the dense 2-layer mucus barrier shielding your delicate intestinal epithelial cells. Without that thick mucus shield, trillions of resident microbes directly touch the epithelial wall, triggering localized immune alarms that erode tight junctions from the outside. Even a casual Friday night drink inflicts mechanical damage, because gut microbes convert ethanol directly into acetaldehyde, a potent cellular toxin that paralyzes tight junction proteins. Another hidden culprit destroying your intestinal seal is frequent NSAID usage, like popping ibuprofen after workouts, which directly starves intestinal cell mitochondria of energy. Because maintaining tight junctions requires massive amounts of cellular energy, depleted mitochondria force the epithelial barrier to loosen within just 48 hours of NSAID exposure. This brings us to the $60 question: why do overpriced L-glutamine powders and fancy probiotic blends fail to cure chronic intestinal permeability for most Americans? While L-glutamine serves as essential fuel for enterocytes, dumping free amino acids onto an inflamed intestinal wall is like spraying paint over structural drywall cracks. Furthermore, swallowing billions of generic probiotic bacteria without first removing dietary emulsifiers and gliadin triggers simply adds more microscopic traffic to an already broken border crossing. True epithelial repair only begins when specific keystone bacteria produce butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that directly signals your DNA to synthesize brand new tight junction proteins. So how exactly do you cultivate these butyrate-producing keystone species without spending a dime on commercial supplements? The answer lies in 2 precise prebiotic fibers. To separate science from supplement marketing, we have to distinguish between a real biological phenomenon and a profitable wellness diagnosis. In gastroenterology, increased intestinal permeability is a documented, measurable physical state where your gut lining loses some molecular cell activity. Leaky gut syndrome, however, is an unvalidated alternative diagnosis that blames this microscopic barrier shift for virtually every chronic human illness. To understand how the barrier truly breaks down, look at what sits right above those delicate single-cell epithelial walls. Your cells are shielded by a dense 2-layer gel shield of mucus that acts like a biological security moat. The outer layer is loosely packed and teems with trillions of microbes actively feeding on complex dietary fibers. Beneath that sits the inner mucus layer, a tightly woven sterile defense zone where bacteria are strictly forbidden to enter. When your diet lacks diverse plant fibers, those starving outer microbes pivot and begin digesting your protective inner mucus wall. Without fiber, specialized bacteria like Akkermansia muciniphila overconsume the glycoprotein barrier until your underlying cells are completely exposed to luminal pathogens. Once that physical buffer erodes, bacterial fragments come into direct contact with the fragile microvilli of your intestinal lining. This direct microbial contact triggers the release of inflammatory cytokines, signaling tight junction proteins to unanchor from their cellular moorings. Dietary fiber deficiency isn't the only modern offender dismantling your intestinal barrier. Common over-the-counter medications can rapidly trigger identical damage. High doses of NSAIDs like ibuprofen block protective prostaglandins, cutting off vital blood flow and oxygen to your gut epithelial cells. Oxygen-deprived epithelial cells suffer localized mitochondrial stress, causing their tight junction gates to swing wide open within hours of ingestion. Chronic alcohol consumption inflicts even greater damage by producing toxic acetaldehyde directly inside the upper digestive tract during routine metabolism. Acetaldehyde aggressively oxidizes structural proteins like occludin and claudin-1, literally dissolving the chemical glue holding adjacent cells together. Add ultra-processed dietary emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 into that mix, and you act like detergent stripping away your gut's natural protective grease. Once these physical barriers fail, the real medical problem begins: the uncontrolled bloodstream invasion of bacterial endotoxins called lipopolysaccharides. Lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, are structural components embedded in the outer cell membranes of trillions of gram-negative bacteria inhabiting your colon. When tight junctions open even slightly, free-floating LPS molecules leak across the barrier and enter directly into your mesenteric circulation. Your immune system treats circulating LPS like an active bacterial invasion, immediately activating specialized patrol sensors called toll-like receptor 4. This receptor activation triggers metabolic endotoxemia, a chronic, low-grade systemic inflammatory state that quietly burns throughout your entire vascular network. Metabolic endotoxemia is the proven mechanism connecting intestinal permeability directly to insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, and arterial plaque progression. Notice the difference. Legitimate science proves permeability drives inflammatory metabolic disease, but it does not cause every vague fatigue symptom. This critical scientific nuance is exactly what wellness influencers intentionally exploit when selling expensive gut healing protocols and unverified diagnostic testing. If you walk into a holistic clinic today complaining of brain fog, you will likely be handed a $300 comprehensive stool test. These proprietary panels claim to measure zonulin levels in stool to diagnose a leaky gut with absolute mathematical certainty. Here is the contrarian medical truth. Commercial stool zonulin assays are notoriously inaccurate because they frequently cross-react with unrelated intestinal proteins. Leading gastroenterology researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that commercial stool kits cannot reliably differentiate between a healthy barrier and severe clinical permeability. Even worse than unreliable stool zonulin assays is the $300 IgG food sensitivity blood panel marketed to identify your exact gut triggers. To understand what breaks this barrier, we must examine what actually triggers zonulin release inside your gut lumen. Let's look at the two proven molecular triggers. The first documented trigger is bacterial endotoxin, specifically lipopolysaccharides from gram-negative bacteria colonizing your small intestine. When these microbes overgrow, they directly assault your epithelial border. These endotoxins bind to toll-like receptor 4 on your intestinal cells, igniting an intracellular alarm signaling complex. This inflammatory cascade instantly weakens the tight junction anchor proteins. The second confirmed zonulin trigger is gliadin, a complex protein fragment found within dietary gluten. Gliadin latches onto the CXCR3 receptor on your intestinal surface. Once gliadin docks, your enterocytes pump zonulin into the intestinal lining, pulling apart occludin strands like microscopic zippers. But here is the critical physiological nuance online gurus ignore. In healthy humans, this gluten reaction causes a brief gap that reseals within several hours without permanent damage. Your intestinal lining is designed to flex and recover quickly. However, in celiac disease or severe intestinal inflammation, those tight junctions get locked open permanently. This persistent permeability allows larger peptide fragments and toxins to flood your submucosa. Beneath this wall sits 70% of your immune system, called gut-associated lymphoid tissue. When invaders break through, these cells launch an immediate systemic counterattack. This leakage triggers metabolic endotoxemia, a low-grade chronic inflammatory state driven by circulating bacterial components. That underlying inflammation directly sabotages your insulin sensitivity and liver metabolism. Yet this is precisely where medical reality separates from lucrative internet pseudoscience. While intestinal permeability is a real measurable condition, the online alternative medicine industry has weaponized it. Influencers blame leaky gut for everything from brain fog to joint pain. They falsely promote a downstream biological symptom as the root cause of all illness. In clinical gastroenterology, permeability is rarely the primary villain starting the fire. Instead, it is almost always secondary collateral damage caused by underlying chronic inflammation or stress. To monetize this fear, clinics aggressively push diagnostic IgG food sensitivity panels. Patients routinely spend hundreds of dollars on reports showing reactions to dozens of healthy foods. But basic immunology tells us those elevated IgG antibodies actually indicate immune tolerance, not toxicity. High antibody levels simply prove your gut has safely recognized that food. Following those misleading lab panels forces patients into unnecessarily extreme elimination diets. Removing diverse nutrient sources starves beneficial gut microbes and paradoxically degrades the protective mucus barrier. Next comes the lucrative supplement funnel, where influencers prescribe proprietary leaky gut repair protocols. These commercial packages routinely cost over $200 per month for unproven herbal blends. The primary ingredient in most commercial repair kits is the amino acid L-glutamine. While intestinal cells do consume glutamine for energy, oral supplements require specific clinical conditions. Trials show glutamine aids barrier repair in trauma and chemotherapy patients. But robust evidence showing it cures everyday digestive bloating in healthy adults simply does not exist. The same marketing hype surrounds bone broth and collagen peptides sold as intestinal sealants. While they provide basic amino acids, drinking bone broth cannot directly patch open junctions. If expensive powders cannot magically glue your barrier shut, what actually restores intestinal integrity? The real scientific solution begins with short-chain fatty acids produced by colon bacteria. When beneficial microbes ferment dietary fiber, they produce butyrate, the primary fuel source for your colonic epithelial cells. Butyrate directly stimulates enterocytes to manufacture stronger clotting junction proteins. Furthermore, healthy gut microbes trigger your goblet cells to synthesize mucin 2 proteins. This dense mucosal layer acts as a physical shield, preventing bacteria from touching epithelial cells. When you consume a typical Western diet devoid of plant fibers, your starving microbiome shifts its metabolism. Deprived of fiber, those hungry bacteria begin devouring your mucus barrier. Beyond fiber deficiency, ultra-processed foods contain synthetic emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose. Clinical models confirm these additives directly strip away your protective mucus gel layer. Another major culprit behind barrier erosion is chronic ibuprofen or aspirin use. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs inhibit prostaglandin synthesis, shutting down blood flow required for epithelial cell renewal. Excessive alcohol consumption acts as a direct chemical solvent on your intestinal lining. Ethanol metabolites induce severe oxidative stress, rapidly dislodging anchor proteins from your cell walls. Finally, elevated cortisol from chronic sleep deprivation or psychological stress physically alters your gut architecture. Stress hormones directly suppress the rapid regeneration of healthy stem cells. True mucosal recovery requires correcting these fundamental metabolic and lifestyle disruptions first. You simply cannot out-supplement a diet of synthetic emulsifiers, daily ibuprofen abuse, and sleep deficit. When patients face real barrier dysfunction, doctors check objective inflammatory markers like fecal calprotectin or perform endoscopies. Authentic diagnosis requires verified pathology, not speculative online quizzes. So how do we rebuild this mucosal barrier using clinical science instead of commercial gimmicks? The exact roadmap requires targeting 3 specific cellular mechanisms in strict order. When your tight junctions stay wedged open chronically, bacterial debris from your colon doesn't just irritate local tissue. Gram-negative endotoxins spill directly into your portal circulation. These endotoxins, specifically called lipopolysaccharides or LPS, are structural components of bacterial cell walls. Once inside the bloodstream, they bind immediately to toll-like receptor 4. That binding event triggers an immediate immune cascade, flooding your serum with inflammatory cytokines like tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6 without any active infection. Scientists call this silent, low-grade inflammatory state metabolic endotoxemia. Unlike acute septic shock, this slow smoldering fire damages cellular insulin signaling over months and years. Because blood from your intestines flows straight to the liver via the portal vein, hepatocytes take the first hit, blocking normal glucose uptake and driving fat accumulation. So while online gurus blame minor intestinal leaks for mysterious brain fog, the real, verifiable danger is this direct link between gut permeability and systemic insulin resistance. This brings us to the massive $400 commercial testing industry capitalizing on your gut anxiety. Let's examine what those popular mail-in test kits actually measure. The gold standard research tool is the lactulose to mannitol urine test, where you drink 2 distinct sugars to see how many cross your epithelial barrier over 6 hours. Mannitol is tiny and absorbs effortlessly through healthy cells, while lactulose is much larger and only slips through if tight junction complexes are physically damaged or broken. However, direct-to-consumer versions of this sugar test are notoriously unreliable because rapid intestinal transit times and slight variations in kidney filtration drastically distort the final results. Even more misleading are those $250 IgG food sensitivity panels that claim a high antibody count proves your gut lining is leaking half-digested food particles. In reality, elevated IgG4 antibodies to eggs or dairy simply mean your immune system recently encountered those foods and successfully built oral tolerance, not disease. When patients eliminate 20 healthy foods based on those false IgG reports, they starve beneficial bacteria of diverse fibers, which paradoxically worsens real barrier permeability. Instead of wasting hundreds of dollars on unvalidated commercial tests, let's focus on how your gut lining naturally regenerates and repairs itself from the inside out. Your entire intestinal epithelial monolayer completely replaces itself every 3 to 5 days as specialized stem cells at the base of intestinal crypts rapidly divide. These fresh enterocytes migrate upward along the villi in a synchronized cellular escalator, shedding old damaged cells into the lumen while tight junctions reseal beneath them. To maintain this hyperactive cellular turnover without failing, your colonocytes require a massive amount of metabolic fuel, and they do not run on dietary blood glucose. Over 70% of their total energy comes directly from butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid produced when commensal microbes ferment soluble prebiotic dietary fibers. At the molecular level, butyrate acts as a histone deacetylase inhibitor, directly upregulating the genetic expression of claudin-1 proteins that lock adjacent cells firmly together. If you consume a standard low-fiber Western diet, starved luminal bacteria will turn around and consume your protective mucin 2 protein layer just to survive. Once that dense inner mucus barrier thins below 50 microns, pathogenic microbes physically touch your epithelial membrane, triggering chronic local inflammation and barrier rupture. Now let's examine the most heavily marketed supplement for permeability repair, L-glutamine, sold across US health food stores as an overnight leaky gut cure. Glutamine is indeed the preferred nitrogen donor and fuel source for rapid enterocyte proliferation, especially after extreme physical trauma, intense endurance exercise, or chemotherapy stress. However, swallowing 5 grams of glutamine powder will not magically seal tight junctions if you continue feeding pathogenic bacteria, refined sugars, and ultra-processed seed oils. For lasting repair, you must introduce specific dietary polyphenols from dark berries, pomegranates, and green tea that directly stimulate goblet cells to secrete fresh mucin. These unabsorbed polyphenol compounds selectively feed Akkermansia muciniphila, a keystone bacterium that constantly prunes old mucus, forcing your tissue to build a denser, impenetrable barrier. Furthermore, your enterocyte cell membranes require high levels of eicosapentaenoic acid from marine omega-3 fats to maintain structural fluidity and resist cytokine-induced junction breakdown. Another surprising scientific reality is that tight junction permeability follows a strict circadian rhythm, peaking in late afternoon and tightening dramatically while you sleep overnight. When you consume heavy meals or sugary snacks right before midnight, you disrupt those internal clock genes, leaving intestinal gaps vulnerable during peak digestive repair hours. This circadian vulnerability brings us to the hidden psychological trigger that strips mucosal defense faster than any dietary toxin, chronic elevation of your adrenal cortisol hormone. To actually repair intestinal permeability, we have to look past commercial supplement blends and focus directly on tight junction protein assembly. Your epithelial cells rely on occludin and claudin proteins to zip the barrier shut against luminal toxins and bacterial lipopolysaccharides. The primary molecular signal that tells colonocytes to manufacture and tighten those occludin zippers is butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid. But here is the critical catch. Swallowing oral butyrate capsules rarely works because digestive enzymes degrade them long before reaching your colon. Instead, you must force your endogenous microbes like Faecalibacterium princeps to ferment specific prebiotic fibers inside your lower digestive tract. Feeding these keystone bacteria-resistant starch from cool potatoes and green bananas generates a massive surge in local butyrate production naturally. That butyrate acts as cellular fuel, allowing intestinal lining cells to rapidly regenerate their damaged brush borders every 3 to 5 days. Right above those cells sits a thick protective gel called the mucus layer, mainly composed of the complex MUC2 mucin protein. Think of MUC2 as an impenetrable biological moat that prevents aggressive pathogens from directly touching your sensitive tight junction seals. If you starve your microbiome of diverse plant fibers, starving bacteria literally begin cannibalizing and stripping away that defensive MUC2 barrier. Once that mucus moat thins out, dietary antigens and inflammatory endotoxins make direct contact with your epithelial receptors, triggering immediate leaky gut. To safely thicken this mucus shield, we need to cultivate Akkermansia muciniphila, a unique species that prunes and stimulates healthy muci turnover. You cannot reliably colonize Akkermansia by swallowing a $50 probiotic pill, but polyphenol-rich foods like cranberries and pomegranates feed it naturally. Beyond nourishing your mucosal barrier with exact substrates, we must address the most overlooked physical driver of hyperpermeability, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. When excess microbes colonize your sterile upper small intestine, their metabolic byproducts release toxins that continuously dissolve occludin protein bonds. This happens because constant grazing shuts down your migrating motor complex, the electromechanical wave that sweeps cellular debris out between meals. Spacing your meals 4 to 5 hours apart reactivates that intestinal housekeeper, clearing out misplaced bacteria before they can damage tight junctions. Now let us examine the few targeted micronutrients that actually possess rigorous clinical trial data for repairing epithelial barrier integrity. Forget standard zinc supplements. Zinc carnosine specifically chelates zinc to L-carnosine, so it survives stomach acid and binds directly to ulcerated mucosa. Clinical trials demonstrate that stabilized zinc carnosine cuts aspirin-induced intestinal permeability by over 50% within just 14 days of daily dosing. Another vital and underrated barrier regulator is vitamin D, which acts directly on the nuclear VDR receptors inside your intestinal epithelial cells. When vitamin D binds those cellular receptors, it upregulates the transcription of ZEO1 and claudin genes while suppressing pro-inflammatory cytokine cascades. This means leaving a chronic vitamin D deficiency uncorrected makes it biologically impossible for your gut lining to maintain structural stability under stress. We also cannot ignore the powerful gut-liver axis, specifically the way bile acids modulate tight junction tightness through intestinal FXR receptors. When your liver secretes healthy primary bile acids, they activate allele FXR receptors that release antimicrobial peptides to defend the mucosal boundary. However, consuming excessive processed seed oils and refined sugars alters bile composition, generating toxic secondary bile acids that erode epithelial cell membranes. This mechanism explains why leaky gut is rarely isolated to the intestines. Inflammatory endotoxins inevitably leak straight through the portal vein into your liver. Once bacterial lipopolysaccharides flood the liver via that portal circulation, they trigger hepatic inflammation that compromises whole body insulin sensitivity and systemic metabolism. So instead of throwing hundreds of dollars at unvalidated microbiome testing kits, you need a targeted strategy built around structural barrier reinforcement. Let us look at how you can construct an evidence-based daily gut repair protocol that truly seals a clue in proteins without wasting your money. So instead of spending $100 a month on trendy repair formulas, your real leverage comes from targeting circadian mucosal regeneration while you sleep. Your intestinal lining replaces its entire epithelial layer every 3 to 5 days, driven by overnight melatonin production and a clean 12-hour fasting window. When you eat late at night, you halt the migrating motor complex, leaving undigested proteins to press against unsealed tight junctions for 8 straight hours. Beyond meal timing, chronic psychological stress floods your system with cortisol, directly suppressing vagal tone and causing your intestinal barrier to physically loosen up. Specifically, high cortisol triggers intestinal mast cells to release histamine and tryptase, enzymes that literally break apart the protein bridges holding your barrier together. That means taking 5 slow diaphragmatic breaths before your meals isn't just relaxation fluff. It physically closes mucosal gaps via instant parasympathetic acetylcholine signaling. Physical exercise works the same way. Moderate resistance training elevates protective butyrate producers, whereas grueling 3-hour marathons in the heat temporarily trigger ischemic gut leakage. When you combine consistent circadian fasting, stress reduction, and whole food fiber, measurable drops in serum endotoxins typically occur within just 21 to 28 days. Crucially, stop viewing your intestinal barrier like a fragile sheet of glass. It is a dynamic, highly adaptable shield built to heal when given proper materials. So while leaky gut hype tries to sell you expensive cures for imaginary diagnoses, true intestinal permeability is real, measurable, and completely modifiable through daily biology. By protecting those single-cell mucosal junctions today, you are actively preventing chronic metabolic endotoxemia and guarding your cellular longevity for decades to come. That's how you repair your barrier without a $500 clinic bill. Hit like if you value real science and comment below what gut symptom bothers you most. Subscribe to keep your health advice fluff-free. Next week, we are diving into how zero-calorie artificial sweeteners secretly starve your Akkermansia bacteria, so I will see you then.